I still remember the look on that man's face. Snow blowing sideways across the neighborhood. His boots sinking into nearly 2 feet of fresh powder. One hand clutching a certified envelope like he was delivering a winning lottery ticket instead of trying to make my life miserable. He stopped at the edge of my perfectly clear walkway, looked down at the warm bricks with that tight little smile I'd come to recognize over the years, and said, "You have 24 hours to shut this thing down, Mr. Walker. After that, the fines begin." I looked past him at my 80-year-old mother standing safely behind the front window, then back at him and thought to myself, if this is really the hill you want to die on, you picked the wrong winter. My name's Daniel Walker, and until all of this happened, I honestly believed the biggest mistake you could make in a neighborhood was forgetting to bring your trash cans in before sunset. I wasn't the guy who argued at HOA meetings. I wasn't writing angry emails, and I definitely wasn't looking for a fight. I was an engineer by trade, a widower by circumstance, and the primary caregiver for my mother after she shattered her hip the previous winter slipping on black ice just 3 feet from our front porch. Watching her lying there in the snow that morning, unable to stand, trying to smile through the pain because she didn't want me to panic, that's something a son never forgets. After surgery and months of rehabilitation, I made myself one promise. She would never have to walk across an icy path again if there was anything I could do about it. So I spent almost $12,000 installing a heated walkway beneath our front pavers. Every permit was approved, every inspection passed, every contractor licensed. The system was simple, really. Sensors measured moisture and temperature, and whenever conditions were right for ice to form, the heating cables automatically warmed the stone just enough to keep the surface dry. It wasn't flashy. Most people walking by didn't even realize it was there until they noticed there wasn't a single patch of ice on our property. My mother loved it because she could check the mail without fear. Mrs. Alvarez from 3 houses down started using our walkway whenever she visited because arthritis made winter dangerous for her. The Patterson twins would laugh every morning as they crossed our path on the way to the school bus because they knew they wouldn't slip. Even the mail carrier joked that my house felt like Florida in January. For nearly a year, nobody complained. Then came the biggest snowstorm our county had seen in 2 decades. The weather forecast kept getting worse every few hours until schools closed, businesses shut down, and everyone started emptying grocery store shelves like the end of the world had been scheduled for Friday afternoon. By midnight, the snow was falling so hard you couldn't see across the street. By sunrise, our neighborhood looked like it had disappeared beneath a frozen ocean. Rooftops buried, driveways invisible, cars transformed into white hills with side mirrors sticking out like little frozen ears. And right in the middle of all that, our walkway stretched from the sidewalk to the front door, completely clear, gently steaming in the cold morning air. It looked almost unreal. My mother stood at the window smiling, coffee in her hands, whispering, "Best money you've ever spent." I smiled too, for about 10 minutes. That's when I saw a figure making his way down the street. Heavy coat, expensive boots, bright red HOA armband. Nathan Caldwell, HOA president for almost 9 years. The kind of man who could somehow turn planting flowers into a policy violation if he didn't like the color. Nathan had always hidden behind words like consistency, community standards, and preserving property values, but everyone knew the truth. He loved control far more than he loved the neighborhood. Some people collected antique cars. Nathan collected authority. He finally reached my driveway breathing hard, brushed snow off his shoulders, stared at the warm bricks beneath his feet, then looked me straight in the eyes. "Beautiful system," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "It's also completely out of compliance with architectural uniformity." I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He handed me the envelope and calmly explained that my heated walkway created an unfair visual contrast with neighboring properties during winter storms and violated the HOA's appearance guidelines. According to the notice, I had 24 hours to permanently deactivate the system or face a $500 daily fine until compliance was achieved. I remember reading the letter twice because surely no reasonable person would demand that an elderly woman risk another broken hip just so everyone's driveway could look equally miserable. "Nathan," I said quietly, "my mother can barely walk." He shrugged. "Rules apply equally to everyone, even during a blizzard." Another shrug. "Especially then." He turned and slowly walked back into the snow, leaving me standing there holding that ridiculous letter while the wind carried little spirals of snow across the only safe path on the entire street. I wanted to argue. I wanted to chase him down. Instead, I went inside, made my mother another cup of coffee, told her everything would be fine, and headed to the basement to shut off the heating system, because sometimes protecting the people you love means swallowing your pride before picking your battles. I had no idea that battle was about to choose me instead. As I reached for the control panel, something caught my eye. The pressure gauge on the incoming water line was reading far higher than it ever had before. And as an engineer, strange numbers have a way of pulling at your curiosity like loose threads on an old sweater. I figured I'd spend 5 minutes checking it before shutting everything down. 5 minutes that would end up changing not only my life, but the future of our entire neighborhood forever. I grabbed a flashlight, a notebook, and the old blueprints the previous homeowner had left behind in a dusty filing cabinet years earlier, mostly because that's just how my brain works. When something doesn't make sense, I can't simply ignore it and hope it fixes itself. The pressure coming into the house was almost 20% higher than what I had recorded during routine maintenance the year before, and while most people would never notice something like that, engineers spend their lives paying attention to tiny details because tiny details usually point toward much bigger problems. At first, I assumed the city must have adjusted one of the pumping stations because of the storm, but after checking the county utility website, I found no maintenance notices, no emergency advisories, nothing. Then I remembered something my late father used to tell me whenever we worked on old farm equipment together. If the answer isn't where it's supposed to be, start following the pipes. So that's exactly what I did. The mechanical room in my basement backed up against the original utility access built when the subdivision was first developed, almost 20 years earlier. Behind a removal panel I had never bothered opening before was a maze of aging pipes, shut-off valves, faded inspection stickers, and one strange branch line that wasn't shown anywhere on the official plans. That bothered me enough to keep digging. I traced every visible connection until nearly midnight, comparing the real plumbing against the construction drawings, and every hour the questions multiplied instead of disappearing. Around 1 in the morning, I called my friend Kevin Mercer, a retired city building inspector who had forgotten more about infrastructure than most contractors would ever learn. He laughed when I apologized for waking him up. "Danny," he said, "if you're calling me during a blizzard, either your furnace exploded or you found something weird. Definitely the second one." I texted him a few pictures, and less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. His voice had completely changed. "Don't touch another valve, and don't tell anyone what you found until you know exactly what you're looking at." That wasn't exactly comforting. The next morning, the storm had finally slowed, but Nathan's deadline was still ticking away in the back of my mind. Instead of shutting down the walkway, I drove as carefully as I could to the county records office after learning they had reopened with limited staff for emergency operations. Most people don't realize just how much information sits inside those old public archives if you're willing to spend a few hours reading dusty maps and forgotten permits. A woman named Linda, who had worked there longer than anyone could remember, noticed the subdivision name on my request form and smiled. "That neighborhood again," she muttered. I looked up. "Again?" She hesitated for a second before saying, "Nothing. Probably nothing. The original developer was always filing amended utility plans back in the day." That sentence stayed with me. After nearly 3 hours of searching through digitized records and old paper files, I found the original infrastructure proposal submitted before our neighborhood was built. According to those documents, every home was supposed to be connected directly to the municipal water system before occupancy permits were issued. Then, I found a revision filed 6 months later, showing a temporary private well would be used during construction until the city completed an expansion project. Temporary. That word was circled 3 separate times in the engineering notes, but I couldn't find a single document confirming the temporary system had ever been disconnected. My stomach tightened. I asked Linda if there were any final inspection reports closing out the project. She searched another database, frowned, then quietly shook her head. "That's odd." Odd was becoming my least favorite word. I drove straight to Kevin's house, spread everything across his kitchen table, and watched him compare document after document in complete silence. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. Dan, if these records are accurate, there's only one explanation, which is," he looked me dead in the eye, "your neighborhood may still be running on that temporary well." I actually laughed because the idea sounded impossible. "Kevin, there are almost 400 homes in a subdivision." "Exactly. Nobody would have missed something that big." He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out an old county utility map and pointed toward a wooded parcel just outside our HOA boundary. "Do you know who owns this land?" I looked at the name printed on the parcel. "Caldwell Property Holdings, LLC. My smile disappeared. Nathan Caldwell, the HOA president. That afternoon, Kevin and I hiked through knee-deep snow toward the tree line where the old utility easement should have ended years ago. Hidden behind a locked chain-link fence covered with vines and years of neglect sat a small concrete pump house that looked abandoned from the outside. The lock itself was brand new. That was the first thing that sent chills down my spine. The second was the low mechanical hum coming from inside. Kevin looked at me and whispered, "That's not an abandoned building." Through a cracked service vent, we could see pressure tanks, filtration equipment, and active pumps cycling exactly the way a live water system would. Everything was running. Everything. I just stood there staring because the realization hit me all at once. Every shower, every faucet, every glass of water my mother had drank for years, every sprinkler, every dishwasher, none of it had been supplied by the city system we were all paying for. We drove straight back to my house, where I pulled out years of utility bills. Every month I had paid a water service charge listed as municipal distribution. Every neighbor had too. I called 3 families I trusted and asked them to check their statements. Same charge, same amount, same utility description. Then Kevin made a phone call to an old colleague still working for the Regional Water Authority. 20 minutes later, we had our answer. The city had no active service account for our subdivision. Not one. My heart started pounding so hard I could actually hear it. "That's impossible," I kept repeating. The man on speaker calmly replied, "Sir, impossible or not, we have no record of supplying potable water to your development for approximately 18 years. 18 years. I walked outside and looked across the neighborhood. Kids were building snowmen. Couples were shoveling driveways. My mother was waving at Mrs. Alvarez from the porch. Hundreds of ordinary people were living completely normal lives without the slightest idea that something was terribly wrong beneath their feet. That's when another piece suddenly clicked into place. Nathan had never actually cared about my heated walkway. It wasn't about appearance. It wasn't about architectural harmony. My walkway had simply forced people to look at my property during the biggest snowstorm in decades. It drew attention. It brought neighbors together. People stopped, talked, asked questions, admired the system. And if enough curious people started paying attention to one property, maybe eventually they'd start paying attention to other things too. Maybe even the infrastructure nobody was supposed to notice. Whether that had been Nathan's thinking or not, I still don't know for certain. But the timing suddenly felt far too convenient to ignore. Kevin broke the silence. "Danny, you don't call the HOA about this." I looked at him. "Who do I call?" He smiled without smiling. "Everyone else." So that evening, while the deadline on Nathan's ridiculous violation notice quietly expired, I sat at my kitchen table with my mother sleeping upstairs, a folder full of documents spread out beside me, and my phone in my hand. My first call went to the county health department. My second went to the state water resources division. My third went to an old college roommate named Emily Ross, now an investigative journalist who loved one thing almost as much as coffee: uncovering stories powerful people desperately wanted buried. By midnight, every agency involved had promised to send inspectors as soon as roads became passable. I finally leaned back in my chair completely exhausted, convinced the hardest part was over. I couldn't have been more wrong, because what those inspectors would uncover over the following week wasn't just an unauthorized water system. It was a trail of money, deception, and corruption that reached far beyond one arrogant HOA president. And by the time federal investigators entered the picture, Nathan Caldwell would have far bigger problems than a heated walkway. The inspectors arrived 3 days later just after sunrise, their trucks crawling through the last patches of packed snow while half the neighborhood watched from behind frosted windows, wondering why the county health department, the State Water Resources Division, and 2 unmarked government vehicles had all shown up at the same time. Nathan Caldwell marched across the street wearing the same confident grin he'd worn every time he lectured homeowners about mailbox colors or garbage cans, waving a clipboard as if he still believed he controlled the situation. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked with practiced confidence. One of the inspectors barely looked up from his paperwork. "Actually, sir, we'd appreciate it if you stepped aside." For the first time since I'd known him, Nathan looked confused. The inspection lasted nearly 9 hours. They collected water samples, opened underground access points, reviewed maintenance logs, and eventually cut the lock off the small pump house Kevin and I had found hidden beyond the tree line. By late afternoon, the mood had completely changed. Nobody was smiling anymore. One technician quietly walked over to another and whispered something that immediately brought 3 more investigators running. A little later, the lead inspector approached me. "Mr. Walker, thank you for making those phone calls." "How bad is it?" I asked. He paused before answering. "Much worse than we expected. The temporary construction well had never been properly decommissioned. Instead, Someone had upgraded it over the years, replacing equipment piece by piece while allowing the entire subdivision to believe it was receiving fully treated municipal water. Although the water itself wasn't catastrophically contaminated, the system had operated for years without the inspections, testing schedules, reporting requirements, or public oversight required by law. Then came the financial records. The city confirmed once again that it had never billed our neighborhood because it had never supplied our neighborhood. Yet every homeowner had continued paying monthly municipal water charges through HOA assessments. Someone had been collecting money for a service that didn't exist. Over 18 years, those payments added up to well over $2 million. By then, the story had already reached Emily. Her first article went live before sunset, and within hours, local television crews filled the entrance to our subdivision. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another suddenly gathered in driveways comparing utility statements, canceled checks, and old HOA newsletters. People weren't just angry, they were embarrassed. We had trusted the system because that's what communities are built on. Trust. Mrs. Alvarez stood beside my mother with tears in her eyes, quietly saying, "I've been making baby formula for my grandchildren with that water for years." My mother squeezed her hand without saying a word. Sometimes silence says everything. Nathan disappeared for almost 2 days before finally calling an emergency HOA meeting, insisting everything had been misunderstood and blaming decades-old paperwork errors left behind by the original developer. Maybe that explanation would have worked if investigators hadn't already begun tracing the money. Bank transfers connected maintenance accounts to private businesses. Vendor contracts led to shell companies. Several signatures on engineering certifications didn't belong to the licensed professionals whose names appeared on the documents. Every day, another piece fell into place, and every new discovery made the previous one look smaller. Then, early one cold Tuesday morning, I looked out my front window and saw 3 dark SUVs stopping in front of Nathan's house. Men and women wearing navy jackets stepped out with calm, deliberate movements that somehow carried more authority than shouting ever could. My mother walked up beside me and quietly asked, "Who are they?" Before I could answer, one of the jackets turned just enough for the yellow letters across the back to catch the morning light. FBI. Nathan opened his front door, still talking on his cell phone, until he noticed who was standing there. From where I stood, I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough. "Mr. Caldwell, we have a federal warrant." His shoulders seemed to drop all at once. The man who had once threatened to fine me $500 a day because my walkway stayed free of ice now stood speechless as investigators carried boxes of records, computers, and financial files out of his home. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. No handcuffs in front of television cameras. Just quiet professionalism, somehow making the moment even more powerful. A week later, every violation notice issued against my property was formally withdrawn. The HOA board resigned one member after another until a court-appointed administrator took over the association. Independent audits began. Residents eventually received partial reimbursements through insurance claims and legal settlements, though everyone agreed no amount of money could fully repay years of broken trust. A few months later, after winter had finally surrendered to spring, my mother walked down our heated pathway without her cane for the first time since her accident. She stopped halfway, looked back at me, smiled, and said, "You know, maybe that man did us one favor." I laughed. "How's that?" She looked toward the quiet street where children were riding bicycles again. "If he hadn't come here trying to bully you, none of this would have ever been uncovered." I think about that more often than I'd like to admit. Sometimes the people who try hardest to intimidate you accidentally shine a light on the very secrets they're desperate to protect. Looking back now, I don't remember the certified letter nearly as much as I remember the decision not to ignore one strange pressure gauge. Curiosity uncovered what anger never could. So here's the question I've never been able to answer. If you had been standing in my shoes that morning, would you have simply shut the system off, paid the fine, and moved on with your life? Or would you have started asking questions, even if you had no idea where those questions might lead? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments, because I read every one of them. And if you've ever lived under an HOA or dealt with someone who believed rules mattered more than people, I'd really like to hear your story. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes the truth always has a way of finding daylight, even after the longest winter.